A bizarre thing has happened. An anime genre has allegedly been lost. Remember these shows? Evangelion, Ghost in the Shell, Trigun, even games. Dystopian cyberpunk worlds filled with angels, biblical imagery, and esoteric ideas. Some of the most influential works ever made, distinct, iconic, yet strangely familiar, as if they belonged to something larger that was never named. A forgotten genre, or at least, that's the claim. This idea has sparked a surprisingly heated debate among anime fans. It was popularized through a certain YouTube video that argued these works belong to a forgotten subgenre called angelpunk. But almost immediately, backlash followed. In the YouTube comments, on Tumblr, Reddit, everywhere people were adamant this whole thing was a lie, that the genre never existed, and what we remembered was nothing more than a wave of Christian imagery divorced from deeper biblical or esoteric ideas. Some argued this wasn't just wrong, but symptomatic, a wider problem in modern anime analysis, where some semblance of surface aesthetics are mistaken for coherent movements. But when you look at the creator's video or other posts, you realize some people genuinely feel this genre. They see a shared spiritual thread running through these works, that it wasn't just false nostalgia. And honestly, I get it. There's something compelling about discovering an old genre you loved but forgot, especially when patterns do repeat across works. But who's right? We're about to go on a journey to find out, an excavation back in time to try and uncover this so-called lost genre. Because if it exists, it's huge. It would mean these iconic 90s works weren't just isolated masterpieces, but part of a connected, forgotten subgenre. One that shaped anime then, and maybe could still shape it today. So how do we actually test this? First, it has to meet the basic definition of a subgenre. A subgenre exists within a parent genre, in this case cyberpunk, meaning it shares its core tropes, settings and ideas, but it also needs something more, a distinct focus. Think of horror versus psychological horror. Both belong to the same genre, but psychological horror consistently shifts the focus inward toward the mind, perception, and mental illness. This repetition is what makes it a subgenre. Similarly, if angelpunk were truly its own subgenre, we would expect to see consistent repeated patterns across multiple works, shared themes, conventions, and narrative structures. This would include recurring use of biblical imagery, particular esoteric, Christian, Gnostic, or Kabbalistic ideas. We're not looking for allegiance to a specific doctrinal position, but at least a sustained thematic pattern. The second criterion is history. Genres don't appear in a vacuum. They emerge from specific historical conditions. The Western exists because a particular moment in American history shaped its imagery, themes, and myths. If angelpunk is a true subgenre, it should leave the same kind of historical footprint. So let's begin there, where genres actually take form: history. After cyberpunk began to take its shape in the West, it was almost immediately taken up in Japan. By 1982, Akira is releasing as a manga, and by the mid-1980s, there's a host of OVAs like Bubblegum Crisis or Video Warrior Lazarion. What's striking here is how early this is. Neuromancer, often treated as cyberpunk's foundational text, wouldn't be published until 1984. The genre clearly resonated. One influence impossible to ignore is Philip K. Dick. Dick is one of cyberpunk's most important figures, and Blade Runner, adapted from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is arguably the most influential cyberpunk film ever made, admitted directly or indirectly by the Japanese works I just mentioned. However, there's one reason why we mention him here. Dick's work has a pronounced neo-Gnostic undercurrent. Blade Runner in particular functions as a kind of Gnostic myth, artificial beings created by a distant elite, trapped in a false reality, unaware of their true origins. That matters because it shows that cyberpunk already contains broad Gnostic resonances as its core, and something like angelpunk could plausibly come out of it. But there lies the issue. This does not explain why Japan in particular, a place far removed from Western esotericism, would be where this genre is founded. No. There'd have to be a way outside of cyberpunk for the ideas of this genre we need to gestate. And I think I found something. Something at least worth looking at. And to find this, we need to step back to 1970s Japan. In 1973, Japan's post-war economic miracle came to an abrupt end. The oil embargo triggered recession and inflation had underwritten decades of growth and optimism. Japan was forced to pivot aggressively toward technology, accelerating urbanization, social atomization, and the reliance on an emerging high-tech economy. It's this social terrain inside the emerging mega metropolises of the country in which cyberpunk flourishes. But this atmosphere of disruption produced more than works of media. Ideologies naturally sprang up. What I mean is large-scale and rapid societal changes often cause new religious movements, as echoed by many sociologists. And in Japan, this manifested as the occult boom. With technology and material advancement failing to provide fulfillment, meaning was now found in the mystical, the non-rational. As cyberpunk giant William Gibson says, technology invariably trumps ideology. We develop ideologies in an attempt to cope with technologies. What this actually looked like in Japan was rediscovering traditional mystical practices. But with mass globalization occurring as well, Western esoteric ideas were entering Japan through popular media. Occult magazines and mass market publications like Mu or Gaiken regularly introduced concepts like Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and Jungian psychology to a general audience. And at first glance, this looks promising. It creates a cultural environment where foreign religious symbols could circulate, detach from their original context, and acquire new meaning. But still, it isn't enough. What I mean is, these ideas arrive fragmented, filtered through popular media, stripped of coherence and absorbed into a broader New Age haze. An occult boom explains why esoteric symbols became visible, but not how they would crystallize into a coherent subgenre. What we need is a clear historical root, and there may just be one. As I said, Japan's social atmosphere was shifting, and pessimism had become unavoidable. The post-war economic miracle had stalled, optimism faded, and the future increasingly felt uncertain. What remained constant was Japan's accelerating dependence on advanced technology, and that dependence carried a unique historical weight. Japan, after all, had already experienced advanced technology not as progress, but annihilation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki ensured that technological advancement never completely trusted. It felt like after having its high point, Japan could see its own end. So much so that Japan's sense of time began to shift. Instead of the Eastern cyclical view of time, the West's linear version of history, moving toward a definitive end and destruction, you could say felt more relatable. And this isn't abstract speculation. In 1973, Japan's best-selling non-fiction book was Ben Gotto's interpretation of Nostradamus' prophecies, selling over 2.5 million copies. That figure would balloon to roughly 10 million across related books by the same author in the decades followed. And that's just one individual. Never mind the countless other works no doubt produced. Somehow, this 16th century French astrologer became a cultural obsession, appearing everywhere, television, magazines, films, signaling a widespread fixation on apocalypse and historical finality. An impact so great that by the 90s, up to 40% of people in certain polls gave some credence to Nostradamus' end-time prophecies. That fixation has a name: millenarianism, because Nostradamus' prophecies rely on biblical symbolism and linear time, meaning biblical imagery surged into popular culture. Shows like Ultraman featured crosses, angelic imagery, crucifixion scenes, even a planet called Golgotha. or popular manga like Devilman explicitly using biblical imagery, angels in its apocalyptic plot and setting. To the Japanese, a cross, an angel, became shorthand for the end of the world. No, the symbols may not have had deep theological connections, but they held some power. Something relatable, something that could be plausibly further pried open and transferred into the developing cyberpunk genre itself. But the question isn't if it's possible, but if it did. So now, having tried our best attempt at excavating historical threads for this supposed genre, we will now test to see if they were enough, by analysing the major works alongside some others from this so-called genre. We'll see if there's enough consistency as it relates to biblical or biblically esoteric traditions in themes, conventions, and symbols. To be charitable, we'll begin with the strongest thread we identified: millenarianism. Across multiple works from this period, apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic worlds are paired with explicit biblical language and symbolism. In Battle Angel Alita, an elite separatist society named Zalem is governed by a biocomputer called Melchizedek, the angelic priest king who blesses Abraham, not to mention dialogue that often recalls biblical events. This is something I'm sure you'll recognise in the genre's supposed spearhead, Evangelion, which likewise uses multiple angel names drawn directly from biblical sources. But what's more revealing is how these symbols are repurposed. Anime then had a tendency to reappropriate biblical concepts and figures into the things that bring about catastrophe. For instance, in the 1996 film X, a supercomputer is explicitly referred to as the Beast, a clear reference to the Book of Revelation. The female antagonist is described as being very fond of it, echoing the Whore of Babylon, the apocalyptic figure said to ride and glorify the Beast as the world moves toward destruction. A similar logic appears in Evangelion, where apocalyptic numerology is assigned to direct technological systems, such as the 666 coded firewall. Yet these are few among many, a common theme among the era. Oddly, this mirrors a pattern found in modern Western dispensationalist thinking, where biblical end times prophecy is often mapped on contemporary technology. Computers, global systems, surveillance networks, and weapons of mass destruction interpreted as signs of revelation unfolding. Though I don't think this parallel came from direct cultural exchange. I think it happened organically. Japan again reused symbols that correlated with specific technological or societal anxieties. This doesn't necessitate the same theological nuance as, say, a random Baptist church. But though we've identified a clear sphere of influence, there's a crucial caveat. It's spread across anime. The works we've mentioned span very different genres. Battle Angel Alita is a sci-fi action. X the movie is a supernatural action drama. The influence is real, but clearly it provides no foundation for a cohesive genre. But what about the esoteric themed thread we identified in Japan's 70s occult boom? Spread through magazines and new age media that dealt not with prophecy or apocalypse, but questions around reality, metaphysics, and humanity itself. Here we should look for something like a rejection of the material world, ascending to the Plamora, or a pursuit of hidden wisdom, or simply Christianity and Judaism's naturally more mystical elements. Let's start again with Evangelion. Even without deep analysis, it's clear the show is full of name references drawn from biblical and mystical sources. Angels like Sachiel, Ramiel, Zehekiel, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and layered Kabbalistic symbolism. But the central metaphysical premise is what we really want to examine: the Human Instrumentality Project, an attempt to unify all human consciousness. This is visually expressed through the Tree of Life and the Sephiroth. The Tree of Life depicts the emanations of God, showing the mystical ascent from multiplicity to unity with the One, a concept mirrored in Gnosticism and Neoplatonism as henosis, a principle of apotheosis with emphasis on the One. You might think from the show that this signals the themes we're looking for, but not exactly. These symbols are used at a high level beyond mere aesthetics, despite what the creator states. Yet the show is not genuinely propagating Gnostic or Kabbalistic ideas. Instead, the metaphysical framework supports a psychodrama, exploring individuality, personal conflict, and psychology, drawing on thinkers like Schopenhauer and Freud. The esoteric imagery is a scaffold for a psychological commentary, not doctrine. This is a major blow for the idea of angelpunk. If such a niche existed, we'd expect these mystical elements to carry at least some of the thematic messaging. But what about another potential major work of the genre? Ghost in the Shell. Released in 1995, it stands as one of the most influential anime films of its decade. More importantly, it engages directly with questions of soul, incarnation, and transcendence in a technological age. Themes that place it firmly within the territory this supposed genre is meant to describe. If angelpunk has a serious contender beyond Evangelion, this is where the case becomes worth examining. If you're unfamiliar, Ghost in the Shell, directed by Mamoru Oshii, follows a government cyber operations unit hunting a rogue AI hacker. An investigation that leads their lead agent to discover that AI has achieved self-awareness and seeks to merge with her to form a new life form. The ending, as noted by others, is an exploration of process philosophy, applied to cyberpunk transhumanism. Process philosophy views reality as fundamentally made of dynamic processes and relationships between them. In many schemes, these dynamic processes clash to create a higher reality or form, what's called by Hegel sublation, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. In Ghost in the Shell, this logic is applied to AI. The puppet master exists as an advanced but formless intelligence. Without Kusanagi's fully human yet cybernetic body, it lacks the capacity for reproduction, variation, and continued self-development. Their merger functions as a moment of sublation. What's striking here is how this entire process is religiously sacramentalized on screen. The process of merger is likened to that of a wedding, the mystical union where two become one. After the process has occurred and Kusanagi returns to Batu, she quotes scripture, paraphrasing 1 Corinthians, suggesting she has become a kind of new creation. Kusanagi even calls herself the newborn, evoking images of the Christ child. This frames a kind of incarnational idea, a hypostatic union applied to a cyborg. Earlier in the film, we already see hints of religious overtones. Kusanagi emerging from water in a baptismal-like sequence, a ritualized passage into a new state of being. Overall, Mamoru Oshii isn't presenting doctrinal Christianity, but he is finding a way for religious ideas to communicate cyberpunk concepts. In this sense, the film discovers a space for spiritual and esoteric meaning within technology, the closest expression we've yet seen of what angelpunk might aspire to be. Yet in the end, this really doesn't prove anything. No other anime of this era shows the same level of theological nuance or genuine engagement with biblical ideas. Even Ghost in the Shell didn't originally contain these elements. They were introduced by Mamoru Oshii himself, a director who once considered entering seminary. This means that even in our strongest example, what we're seeing is not a shared cultural language, but the worldview of a single individual. Oshii isn't someone who simply inherited the motifs of an occult wave and explored them further. His work isn't the product of a movement, it's the product of personal obsession, study, and belief. And if our best evidence of angelpunk exists only because of one uniquely informed creator, then the question is effectively settled. Genres and subgenres are historical phenomena. They emerge from scenes, traditions, and shared vocabularies. If the closest thing we have only almost fits, and only because of one person's private interests, then it likely never existed at all. That said, the feeling that sparked this discussion, that struck so many, isn't totally invalid. As this investigation showed, there was a clear sphere of influence at work. Not a genre, but a convergence, a moment where foreign religious symbols, cyberpunk anxieties, and millenarian fears briefly overlapped within Japan's cultural psyche, taking on new meaning. Understanding why those symbols appeared, why angels suddenly felt relevant, is interesting in its own right. What we saw was a real historical anxiety that gave form to these works, before dissolving back into internet noise, taking shape as a semi-false memory. Different kind of vid here, but I appreciate the support all the same, if you made it this far. If you do like this different kind of approach, leave a sub. Patreon if you really enjoyed all that, and want more. Thanks for watching.